Good afternoon. This is Safe and Safe Country podcast, and me, its author and host, Alina Frolova. I'll be talking here about the security of Europe, security of Ukraine, about current war, all events which are supporting this war or which are closing the win in this war of Ukraine, of course. And today we will also dedicate a lot of attention to US position and the prospects of this war for 2024. My guest today is Michael Kofman, a military analyst, senior fellow in the Russia and Eurasia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he focuses on the Russian military and Eurasian security issues, and one of the most popular military analysts here in Ukraine, I would say, from the US. Michael, hi, and welcome to this podcast.
Hi, thank you for hosting me.
Okay, let's start from the idea that you served as a director of the Russia Studies program at Center for Naval Analysis. So you're some kind of very focused on and know deeply the Russian army capabilities and naval capabilities. And based on this, how you evaluate now the current situation with Russian forces? What has changed and what we will see this year?
Thanks. So first, regarding Russian forces, I think it's important, folks, to understand that whatever we knew about the Russian military prior to 2022, a great deal has changed. In many respects, that military is now gone. The army that Russia had, with which it invaded Ukraine, a large part of that force has been lost. The people that were in it had been lost, the officers, a fair amount of equipment. Now, Russia hadn't suffered nearly the same losses to its aerospace forces or its navy, but nonetheless, it's clear that there have been significant changes to the Russian military. It's fighting with an increasingly mobilized force, that which consists of people who they have hired and contracted from across Russia. And it's fair to say that they probably lost a generation of officers in this war, at least. And it's not clear what the future of the Russian military will be either. The current leadership under Shoigu, the Minister of Defense, and Gerasimov, the Chief General Staff, both of them are quite old. They're at the end of their 60s. They've served a very, very long time. And it's clear that their impression from this war is that the problem with the Russian military is that it was not Soviet enough, that it was essentially a halfway house, but they felt it was modernized halfway in the wrong direction. I don't think that that's the impression that the rest of the Russian military has. Right? If you look at the views of other officers who are much more successful, much more competent than other folks in the Russian military, I doubt that that's the direction it's ultimately going to go in. But it's the direction that the Russian military is heading in right now. It's heading much more in a direction built around mass and around fighting this war, for lack of a better word, more in the Soviet style than anything else. Okay. So it's also clear that while the Russian military, which started this war, lacked experience in scaling offensive operations, thus conducting war at a large scale, and was missing a lot of the software in the organization. That is, it didn't have the organizational capacity to effectively translate theory into practice. It didn't have the experience effectively from prior wars, prior exercises. That too has changed. The Russian military has evolved quite a bit and has adapted quite a bit over the course of this war in cycles of adaptation, which were led by Ukraine. But nonetheless, you can typically see Russia taking what they think has worked, right, and copying a lot of Ukrainian ideas on the battlefield and then deploying them at scale maybe 3-4 months later. A good example of that might be first-person view drones, which were innovated and led by Ukraine. They can see it in terms of scaling production and getting drones to the actual battlefield. After a while, Russia was able to do that a bit faster just because of industrial capacity. So that's sort of my view, and it's a much longer conversation on evolution of the Russian military. But I think right now it's just essential to study what is happening in this war and to follow this war closely, because a lot of what we know about the Russian military will have changed as a result of this war. Regarding its own capability, I would just broad brush frame it as Russian military has lost a lot of the quality that it had. It's clearly quite weak in the capacity in coordinating forces at scale. So if you see their ability in any offensive operation to coordinate forces deteriorated significantly. It was at its lowest point last winter when you saw the winter offensive led by Gerasimov late January 2023. It looked a bit more capable around Avdiivka this October, but still, in my view, quite poor. And this is why it's important to understand, although Russia may have material advantages in equipment, in manpower, and munition, it's very difficult for them to translate them into some kind of breakthroughs on the battlefield. Because much that we know about combat effectiveness comes down to force employment. It's not just numbers coming off of, spreadsheets. Folks have to understand that the Russian military's ability to effectively employ those forces is very constrained. And I think we've seen that consistently over the last year and a half.
Okay, but you said about this strategy of mass prevailing, but it seems it is working. I mean, that the whole Western countries' armies, have been preparing themselves for high-tech war of the future, with less deployment of tanks, artillery. We saw a decreased production. It happened for the last decades. But now what we see that this typical Soviet approach with mass prevailing is working. And it's working on the third year of this war already. So within the 2 past years, Western world didn't match into this a new picture of the contemporary war, which no one expected.
Okay, so let's put 2 caveats on the word working, right? Because not to be coy this morning, but the word working is doing a lot of work in the conversation. First, it is true that mobilization, both defense industrial mobilization, mass mobilization, right now is working for Russia. There are 2 reasons for that. First, the West waited a very long time to mobilize its resources, even though it had far more potential. If you look, I think by any count, the West has far more capital, it has far more industrial capacity, and is by far a leader in technological innovation. And by any measure, we shouldn't be where we are today in the third year of the war. I think it's a fair assessment. Second, it's working also in part because I think Ukraine has been slow to mobilize some of its resources too. And that's being debated right now very actively in the third year of the war in Ukraine. And I think that's a conversation for Ukrainians to have and resolve. But at the beginning of the war, many Ukrainians turned out to fight, especially prior veterans and volunteers. And there was all these lines outside of the mobilization offices, right? By the second and third year, this also become more and more challenging for Ukraine, right? As Ukraine had lost a significant percentage of the initial force of the military it had in 2022. And large-scale conventional wars, they come down to managing attrition, right? Reconstituting the force, rebuilding your manpower, replacing equipment, and replacing ammunition, right? And through defense industrial mobilization, it really comes down to this over time. And here we can see the second part of why it looked like it'd been working for Russia is that 2023 ended up being a missed opportunity for Ukraine. I think that's the best way to think about it, the best way to frame it. It's not Ukraine's only opportunity. It's not necessarily Ukraine's last opportunity. But right now, Russia's materially advantaged. All right, that being said, it's not working for Russia all that well because Russia's not been able to translate these advantages to achieving even their minimal aims in this war, which is seizing and taking control of the Donbass or any of the territories that they formally annexed, right, of the 4 regions that they formally annexed that they don't fully control. So Russia's actually quite a long ways from achieving even their minimal war aims, and it's not clear that with these advantages that they'll be able to do that. So they are spending right now in defense formally around 6% of GDP, in practice probably more than 8% of GDP. It's the highest Russia has spent on defense as a function of government spending probably since 1991, right? And they likely think that this year is their window of opportunity. But the reality is it's not clear, at least from my point of view, that any of their advantages are decisive enough for it to work, even to achieve the most minimal war aims they have. That is very much in question. I'm not saying this to be optimistic, because I'm not known for being one of those super optimistic analysts that tries to paint a rosy picture. But I think a lot of this is in question right now this year. This year is likely the turning point in this war. And it's a precarious year from my point of view, for both Ukraine and for Western strategy.
And what it could be? I mean, what potentially scenarios you see for this year?
I see a couple scenarios, but maybe it's best to focus on 2 for the purposes of our conversation. So let me paint a positive scenario that I see as a viable scenario, which is that Ukraine this year is able to mount an effective defense. It is able to hold the Russian military and exhaust a lot of its offensive potential at the peak of Russian defense spending. This is very possible. It's not some fantastical proposition that I'm painting. And it's possible because the Russian advantages, from my point of view, are not decisive enough, meaning they're not deterministic. They're there, but you shouldn't assume that they're going to just translate into battlefield victories. Ukraine is able to use this time, as are Western countries, to focus on defense industrial capacity, to consolidate the force, and to invest in the capabilities that will present Ukraine with significant advantages by 2025. In the US and in Europe, there have been very significant investments, for example, in artillery ammunition production. While the ammunition isn't there to support a strategic offensive for Ukraine this year, a major offensive like what you saw last year. And let's be honest, it wasn't there last year either. The United States borrowed a lot of ammunition from South Korea to help make that offensive happen. I'll just be blunt about it. It can be there by 2025, right? So the ammunition production outputs are really going up in the United States, and much more sluggishly, and this has been my frustration for a long time, in Europe. Although Europe on paper has more defense industrial capacity than the United States, they waited a very long time to get moving and have been very slow in getting about it. Okay. So the second part is also addressing force quality, training the Ukrainian military, reconstituting the force. That's a conversation about taking the right lessons from 2023, expanding and fixing training for the Ukrainian military, but also Ukraine itself addressing the issue of mobilization, replacing its losses and generating that force. It takes both the West and Ukraine in this equation. And lastly, kind of a strike component to this campaign. Ukraine has a lot of opportunities to create challenges for Russia, to negate some of Russian advantages, for example, in air power, when it expand the strike campaign, and to help set the conditions for 2025. So this year is not just about defense. It's also about taking the initiative where you can and suppressing a lot of Russian military potential where possible behind the front lines. Right. So this is an optimistic trajectory that shows how you can rebuild the advantage for Ukraine for 2025. And then Ukraine may have another opportunity to deal Russia a major defeat. Basically, you recreate a window of opportunity and try to achieve war termination, on favorable terms. All right. And let's leave the rest of that conversation for Ukrainian leadership to define. But my point is there's a visible path to getting there from where we are now over the next 12 months. All right, let's talk about a negative scenario. Okay, let's say these things don't happen. Let's say U.S. Congress doesn't pass a supplemental. There are real challenges in the United States in providing funding, material assistance. Ukraine doesn't resolve some of its own defense contracting issues or its mobilization issues, which are currently being debated. And there's, let's say the right things don't take place this year. And the Russian military is able to perform better than we expect, right? Or maybe better than I expect, although I don't have any clear expectations because it's very hard to make any predictions in a conventional war a year out. This is like, as I always say, military analysis is not fortune telling. If you want fortune telling, you should go to a different profession. So if that is the case, then I see this year as the beginning of a very, very dangerous path where Ukraine may start to lose the war. First, gradually, very gradually, but then perhaps very suddenly. And this is the part that very much worries me. That if the right things don't happen this year, then the Russian advantage, which may not be decisive in 2024, will begin to mount into 2025 and towards 2026. And I think we know with relative confidence that the Russians want to win this war by 2026. They also don't have an incredibly long timeline. Things become very uncertain for them if they're not winning and if they're not generating any momentum into next year. So time may seem like it's on Russia's side in 2024, but it's not necessarily on Russia's time over the medium and long term. So this is the way I view it. And then, of course, folks think that, well, there's the third scenario that the war becomes a stalemate. And I'm a bit skeptical about what that really means, because a stalemate for Ukraine will still be exhausting and Russia will still try to destroy Ukraine's viability as a state, right? Like, you can't imagine a steady state stalemate as a way of life for Ukraine. I don't think that's feasible. And so I don't think a stalemate in reality is what some people think it is in the conversation.
Yeah, for Ukraine, the stalemate obviously is not an option, especially we're suffering now again from intensify of missiles attacks, and each day in this like a claimed stalemate is losing the people, civilians and military, and losing infrastructure. So that's obviously not the case, which we can support. Yeah,
I would just add to that comment that people confuse a stalemate on the front line for a general stalemate in the war. And the reality is that if Ukraine is under regular bombardment, regular strikes by the Russian military, it's clear that folks are not going to invest in Ukraine or not necessarily going to conduct reconstruction. People might not return to Ukraine. And this is part of Russia's objective, right? Russia has minimal war aims, but it's also clear to me that Russia's enduring objective is to destroy Ukraine's viability as a state. They weren't
Mhm.
able to capture it. They weren't able to install a pro-Russian government. So they're pursuing what is their only alternative, trying to destroy Ukraine's actual viability. And so a stalemate or settling for something that looks like a stalemate, from my point of view, is really more playing into this part of the Russian strategy. I don't think it's viable as an approach.
Let's have a look at our coalition, let's say, or partners' intentions. So we all observe the problems in the United States with approving support. And frankly saying, I was hoping that this would be solved in January. And for now, myself, I cannot give any prospects of how it will be. And we see change in situation in Europe, where Europe became more straightforward, at least public claiming of support, yes, and at least public acknowledgement of threat which they have from the Russian side. And if before this coalition was more US led and looked like more united and coordinated, now we see some kind of differences in approach of Europe and United States. How you evaluate this? Do you think that Europe is capable to support Ukraine on the level which is sufficient to realize the optimistic scenario if United States will be still in this hesitating position, let's call it so?
So economically, I think yes. Militarily, I think no. First, Europe simply right now cannot substitute for the United States in provision of key category of ammunition and capabilities the United States is providing to Ukraine, where the United States provides the overwhelming majority of them on a monthly basis, like artillery ammunition. And I think to a lesser extent, air defense interceptors for different systems. But it's important to understand that these are the two kind of treadmills that we keep running on. Ukraine has monthly requirements to sustain defense in terms of air defense munitions and artillery ammunition. And this is kind of a bare minimum that has to be met before we talk about all these other things, right? And so here, the United States is critical. I think the US might be able to find some funding elsewhere, piece it together, but eyeing the current situation very nervously. I've gone from being optimistic to optimistic and pessimistic again over several cycles since this fall, watching this picture unfold in the US Congress. And it's still undecided. I'm not sure where things will settle in the coming weeks. On the difference in approaches, well, the United States is one country, whereas Europe is not. It's not a unitary actor. Remember, as Kissinger used to like to joke that if I want to talk to Europe, who do I call? And this has always been a challenge with Europe. So in Europe, you can find an entire range of policies from the UK, which is essentially all in with Ukraine, and is probably one of Ukraine's strongest supporters, if not Ukraine's strongest supporter, to plenty of folks who would be happy to sign some kind of ceasefire or hope that this war freezes tomorrow, and who are not really that supportive or supportive in name only, let's say. There's a number of countries like that too. And there's plenty of people I see in between. I travel to Europe quite a bit and I hear a whole range of views. And there are major countries in Europe who think that, well, it's stalemated now and maybe it's time to negotiate. And I'm frustrated by their view that the war is stalemated because it's not. It's a transient phase. There are periods in any war where they're stalemated, but there's no stable or durable stalemate in this war that one can observe, right? It's far too early to make that call. So as far as European countries go, I think that there are probably enough countries vested in this war effort to support Ukraine, certainly economically, and to an extent materially. I don't know how much they can take over for the United States because the United States played a key role in the coalition, particularly components of European Command in leading it, in putting together train equip efforts. Yes, Britain led one big separate effort called Interflex in the UK with Sweden. But nonetheless, if you look at the train and equip effort to set up the offensive that took place in 2023, assembling those 9 brigades, getting all the training and equipment, that was led by the United States, right? So I think it's difficult for me to see a European country emerging and trying to replace the US in that role. I think we still have to play the central role, which we do both in European security and in helping coordinate the support effort for Ukraine.
I was thinking about just, that I'm trying to put myself on the place of European politicians, yes, and military leadership. So you have tanks, you have air jets, you have, I don't know, HIMARS and attack helicopters, keeping them for safety's sake because you're thinking about the possible future war with Russia. But at the same time, you can give at least half of it to Ukraine to win it now. And yesterday I saw in Twitter one very good picture produced by some Baltic country where they said that they compared what Poland has ordered for its own defense and what Ukraine has got from all the countries. And the comparison is like some kind of very drastic, let's say so, because, for example, if we see the tanks, Poland order 1,350 and Ukraine received from all over countries 130. And if we're speaking about jets, it's 76 versus 0, helicopters 96 versus 0, HIMARS, Poland only ordered 468 versus 20, which Ukraine received. Does it have any reason behind to keep so many weapons on stocks and so many equipment on stocks and just like a sitting and waiting while Russians come here? Do you see any possibility for Ukraine to, to change this concept of European politicians and to at least to utilize those capabilities which they have now in their army, like eligibility?
So Europe, unfortunately, is a complex picture. The way I look at it is first, European countries at the beginning of the war were generally keen to provide Ukraine Soviet equipment and older stocks that they had, particularly former Warsaw Pact states. Part of the reason they were doing this was not altruistic, but as they were happy to get rid of older Soviet stocks in exchange for a promise that they would get good upgrades of much better equipment from the United States and others. And so Poland had no problem sending 300 T-72s and folks sent what S-300s they had available or what MiG-29s they had available, hoping to upgrade to F-16s. To them, I'm sure it looked like a win-win proposition. All right. Then came the question to more expansive support. And many European countries was older equipment in their stocks, the various versions of M113s, which, by the way, are great. Anywhere I've been on the front line in Ukraine over the last year, the M113 is the battle taxi of choice. Most units want it. And so you should not decry it just because it's like Cold War 60s tech. I know it is, but it's better than a BMP-1 in a lot of cases. So some of this equipment is still pretty decent for the role that it plays. So you get a lot of this older equipment. And to an extent, so did the United States. Like if I look at United States gave MRAPs and various things that we had, those kind of leftover from our fights in Afghanistan and Iraq, which are good vehicles, but I don't think were optimally suited to this war, at least what I saw south of Ariakov. Let's put it that way. I won't go into the tactical details, but I ran into a lot of our equipment that had originally come out of Kuwait and other places in my travels along the front during the offensive. So the way I look at it is that they gave us equipment. It was much easier for them to provide pull-out storage. Then obviously it was a much harder pull to get Leopard tanks and to get more capable equipment out of European hands. That also happened in 2023. The challenge you always have at the end of the day, on the U.S. side, the military is happy to provide equipment if they know that Congress is authorizing funding to backfill that equipment, right, for the force. So as long as they know that money is coming, they're willing to provide equipment, and they're willing to provide it at, I would say a variable cost, because this equipment does not have an objective value. What's the value of MRAP, a mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicle that is used and has been used for 10, 15 years? And so the Pentagon can be flexible in this regard, but they need to know that something will be replaced for the force by Congress. On the European side, I think the challenge is that, one, they have a lot of things on paper in stockpiles. It's not clear how ready it is or how long it would take them to actually make it serviceable. But the same challenge is that they gave a lot of equipment and they're very reticent to give more because no military wants to give away their equipment, their kit. They just don't. It's a very natural for militaries to be protectionist in this regard because most militaries have a hoarding mentality that's better to have and not need. And a lot of countries, for example, I saw Spain. Spain had hundreds of Leopard 2 tanks on the books. They were originally the folks proposing a sort of Leopard 2 coalition program for Ukraine. Then when the coalition emerged in early 2023, Spain very quickly looked around and said, oh, turns out none of our Leopard 2 tanks are ready. We can't find the parts and the manuals and all this. Here are some Leopard 2 tanks that may be sort of water damaged in a facility we had, and we're happy to transfer a few of them out of the hundreds that we have technically in our stockpiles. And I'm not an expert on European security and defense, so I can't speak to this. That's not my role of specialization. I'm just telling you what I myself saw from countries that initially proposed transferring equipment to Ukraine, but when the time came to provide these tanks, they had hundreds of them in their inventory and they could only come up with a handful, right? It was just, as an American, this was interesting to observe. So unfortunately, I don't have a great answer for you because I don't specialize in European defense sectors, but I think part of what's happening is that all the planning for the war has been done on a 6-month basis. And in 2023, the planning was done for the offensive of 2023. And this is a big problem. There was not a long-term strategy and there wasn't a long-term outlook sort of behind it. And when the offensive failed, it's clear that Europeans and to an extent the United States have not stepped forward with what the next strategy looks like and what a long-term vision looks like in this war.
You said the keyword strategy. Let's speak about US strategy. I mean that from now on, it looks like there is no strategy behind. As long as it takes, it's everyone already was speaking about this, that this is look like a counter strategy, not a strategy at all. And we are in the period, and there were a lot of discussions that, for example, United States didn't want to give some kind of required number of weapons of equipment because they wanted to have a victory before election so the Biden can use it. And we have a lot of different type of discussions here, and everyone was trying to catch up. What is the strategy? And in the situation which we have now, we cannot speak about any strategy for now at all. But at least we can just try how you see the strategy if Biden will win the election and how you see the strategy of United States if Trump is winning election.
Okay, so first, a lot is going to be decided in this war before the outcome of the U.S. election makes an impact on U.S. strategy. The next 12 months are critical. So the view I have is that if the right things don't happen this year, the next U.S. president will take office in middle of January of 2025. So over the course of the next 12 months, one of these two trajectories will begin to be set. And it actually matters a lot less who the U.S. president is than people think. Because by that point, we will either be on a trajectory to rebuild an advantage for Ukraine, or we will not. And it'll be difficult to reverse it. I want to be very clear about it.
Okay, what is the strategy of Biden administration now?
So as best as I understand, and keep in mind, I don't speak for the Biden administration. I'm not in it. I myself often wonder what our strategy is. And so to me, this is to some extent my own guesswork. But my impression was that the strategy leading up to the point was to put Ukraine in a place to deal Russia a decisive defeat, right, in 2023. And then put Ukraine in a position to negotiate war termination on favorable terms, essentially on Ukraine's terms. And then also work out a long-term institutional arrangement, right, whereby you would institutionalize security cooperation with Ukraine, and integrating Ukraine into the West was also part of this plank of strategy, right? So the strategy, let's say, maybe has three components. One, strategic defeat of Russian forces in Ukraine, such that Ukraine is in a position to achieve its political aims in the war. Maybe two, institutionalized cooperation. The third one's integration into the West steadily with Europeans. Because remember, a lot of things that people ascribe to being U.S. strategy heavily depends on Europe and U.S. being able to coordinate Europe and corral those efforts too. Like the United States does not have a magical wand, contrary to people's belief, to just make everything happen in European security. And then a host of processes that require the agreements of other countries. But that's sort of my sense of it. The problem with strategy, of course, was one, it kept rolling from short-term 6-month efforts. And this long piece back in last May called Beyond the Offensive and Foreign Affairs, we basically talked about that this is the problem with strategy. The offensive operation was not going to end the war, even if it was successful or not successful, either way. And that we were going to end up at the point where we are now, but it was very visible that we were going to end up in this place last spring, right? And this was an area of strong agreement between me and my colleague, Andrei Zaharnyuk. I remember we were talking about it all last year. And I
Yeah.
was very frustrated that people were expecting one offensive to really achieve something.
Hmm.
And there was clearly no plan after the offensive, none that I could find. Right. So the question was, all right, the offensive ends in September. And then, well, let's say it's successful. Okay. But Russia's not going to end the war just because you have a successful offensive. Then what happens? And it was clear to me that there wasn't a real plan. Beyond that, it was a wait and see approach. Let's see what
Hmm.
happens in the offensive, then we'll see. And that's a big challenge, big problem in the strategy from my point of view. Now, as best I can tell, the strategy is coming together. It's probably more of a long term strategy for the next 12 to 18 months. I don't know for a fact what it is yet. If it's out there, then it's a well kept secret in DC. As we like to joke, you're always skeptical if something exists if you haven't seen it leaked to the newspapers yet. But my sense of it is the thing that you described, the sort of like as long as it takes. This is just a slogan. It's not strategy, right? It's just a statement. The challenge is coming up with a long-term vision from this administration that's going to be at least for 12 to 18 months, which would be a big step forward. But here's the rub. You can take that question and very much point in the other direction. What exactly is Ukraine's strategy? What is Ukraine's military plan? I've not seen anything to suggest that there clearly is one for 2024 or that there's agreement between the military and the political leadership in Ukraine. So there are some real questions about unity of effort in Kiev and alignment between military and political establishment. And I think it's fair to ask, what is Ukraine's strategy for this year? And which one should come first, the United States strategy or Ukraine's strategy that we support? Who should be leading that and then aligning the two? So I want to turn around a bit and say, in Ukraine, I often get these questions, and I think they're very forthright questions to ask. What is the U.S. strategy? Is the U.S. serious about Ukraine winning and this, that, and the other? I think these are the right questions. But in the U.S. and in the other Western countries, the question starts off with, what is the Ukraine strategy? How does Ukraine see its resources aligning with the approach that it wants to take to achieve its objectives in this war? And what does that look like heading into 2024? It's not clear to me that at the end of the offensive in 2023, Ukraine had a strategy for moving forward either. So I'll just put that out there and leave it because it's not possible for the United States and for European countries to have a strategy for Ukraine, which Ukraine needs to first have for itself.
Yeah, that's absolutely agree with you. And this is also the discussions which we have here among the experts, because we have the same fears, let's say. So we don't see any long-term strategy and option one, option two, option three. And yes, we do understand that we are in war, everything is unpredictable, but at least to have some kind of basic planning looks like we also lack it.
Or I would comment cheekily, maybe there are quite a few plans on the books. In Ukraine, different people have these plans, and sometimes I can't tell if it's that there isn't a plan or there are too many plans.
And how does it look from United States? Can these, like all inside Ukrainian obstacles or miscoordination, influence on the level of support? Because what we have here, it's like for latest period, and I believe you know it, that there are a lot of rumors about Zaluzhny to be changed as a chief of command. And that's like quite a possible way of doing business. But will it influence on the level of trust? Will it influence on level of support from United States?
I'm not sure I take your question. About Zaluzhny, I won't comment except to say that I've heard those rumors for some time in Ukraine, and I don't know what to make of them. I'm not an insider in Ukrainian politics. I don't know how changing Zaluzhny is going to change Ukraine's war effort or the challenges that it finds itself in right now. And so from my point of view, I don't think that is going to be a significant factor in aligning Ukraine's strategy with the United States. And I don't think that it's going to be a significant factor in U.S. support either, meaning it doesn't relate to that.
Does it mean that United States at least not claim but percept Ukraine as a strategic partner, or we still don't have this level of, I don't know, not understanding, but understanding of the role of Ukraine?
No, I think the U.S. sees Ukraine as a strategic partner, most definitely. I think that changed very much in this war. I think Ukraine is seen as much as an ally as it can be in the United States without sort of a formal alliance. But alliances are just a subset of alignments, and it's alignments that are really important at the end of the day. So I think that changed. I think that changed significantly in U.S. policy and approach. I think the challenge for Ukrainians is that they still see what the U.S. is doing is not enough, or maybe too late, not in time, right, for their war effort.
Yeah, because we just see If US has clear strategic interest in some region, like Red Sea, for example, we see the level of the reaction and the speed of reaction, yes, and this is something which we constantly compare, Israeli war, Red Sea, and all the other regions, and we do understand that we are lacking this strategic partnership, obviously. Let's speak a little bit more about the prospects of the defense industry. So from the US, obviously, in economic field is like a quite winning position regarding this war. So because the defense industry started to be invested, we have like a quite a big interest to European defense industry. We do understand that this is the prospect, not for 1 year, for 10 years or so. But at the same time, looking at the speed of the development of defense industry in United States, I don't see so much increase in production, placing new enterprises, establishing something new, very high tech in defense industry. Why it's so? It's because of regulations. It's because it's still not obvious for the industry, or what is like a stopping industry from rapid development?
Well, it's usually money, it's contracts, right? What I see, and I think that this is an issue that needs to be addressed this year, is many Western companies operating in Ukraine, using Ukraine as a laboratory or a field test site for a host of technologies, but they don't have contracts, either from our government or from Ukraine's. They don't have contracts to develop these capabilities for Ukraine. They don't have contracts to develop these capabilities for our forces either. And money talks. If you want industry to be responsive, if you want them to start taking their designs, their prototypes, and putting them into production, they need to see money. Second, they need to see long-term money. This is the second challenge. Industry is not going to make investments for a war if they think that this war might be over in a year or 2 years. It's not worth it to them, right? They're not going to build an assembly line or set up production, serial production for something that they think you might not need in a year or two. You have to signal to them that you have multi-year contracts available and you have at least medium-term money that you're willing to put on the barrelhead. That's what we did with artillery ammunition early on in 2022, right? We basically said, look, here's multi-year, multi-billion-dollar contracts. Don't worry about what's going to happen in this war. We're going to buy millions of artillery shells. You get production up. And that's how we got production up significantly over the course of the last year and a half, right? Why the United States was much more successful at this than Europeans, I think. But if you look across sort of these categories of solutions or capabilities, in general, I haven't seen the money there, and I haven't seen multi-year contracts there. It's an issue on our side. It's an issue on Ukraine's side, too, if you talk to Ukraine's Ministry of Defense. It takes them a long time to issue contracts, identify money. I think that's one of the things that the new leadership in the MOD is trying to address, and what the Strategic Industries Office is trying to address as well, because Ukraine has a lot of industrial capacity. In theory, that could be leveraged. And Ukraine also has a ton of people working on this. I mean, there's so many people developing their drones, their own solutions, their own software, lots of companies in Ukraine, lots of innovators. And I've seen it. And if you ask, well, why don't you see these capabilities fielded in any significant numbers on the battlefield? The answer is all process, contracts, finding money, setting up industrial production, and contracting the right way. Not saying, hey, we have a problem. Here, let's get 20 companies that we know, people that we know, and we'll give them all like a share of the contract, and they will all produce this product in insufficient amounts in a non-standardized way. Okay, that's not the right way to scale up industrial production. It's a way to do it, but it's not the right way.
On your view, what would be the future war? How it will look like if we are not speaking about Ukraine, Russia, but everything which will happen after? Where world need to invest in drones, in technologies, in tanks, in artillery, how it will look like, the future war?
Well, future wars look a lot like past wars because most things in war tend to be evolutionary rather than revolutionary. Most of the time, revolutions in military affairs, they're declared, but they rarely arrive. If you look at this war, this is very much a conventional war. You'd be very familiar with this type of war from any part of the second half of the 20th century. And you look at most technologies that have been employed in this war, they've been employed as additive rather than substitution of existing capabilities. I can't think of anything that drones have replaced on the battlefield. They haven't replaced artillery. They haven't replaced field mortars. They haven't replaced air power. They haven't replaced the requirement for anything that I know of that's a 20th century technology. Okay. Now, they have led to changes in tactics, in force employment. they do drive observable trends. For example, dispersal on the battlefield, right? Or the challenge in operating in an environment where there's pervasive surveillance and intelligence, where you can see most things both day and night, at least at the tactical level. We can have a much longer conversation. There's always a dialectic in war between, let's say, the few and complex and the many and simple, and you need both. But at the end of the day, when it comes to conventional warfare at this scale, it very much comes down to managing attrition. From my point of view, it comes down to primarily destruction-oriented approaches over maneuver warfare. And the West has a strong preference for maneuver warfare. This is a doctrinal debate, an enduring doctrinal debate and thinking. And much of it comes down to, the two big factors, right? Material advantage, and most importantly, force employment, high employed forces. And what separates militaries is the ability to employ forces at scale, right? Which is to say, most militaries, what they could do with a few companies or a few battalions, they cannot do with several brigades. They cannot scale up that action. And most importantly, they cannot scale complexity. This is one of the big advantages of the U.S. military, right? It's not just that we do logistics well, or that we have much more advanced technology, or that we just have a lot more of it, right? Because we have a $700 billion plus budget, I think $800 billion at this stage. But it's that we are able to scale the employment of forces and the conduct of very complex operations. The Russian military failed at this early on. They lacked the organizational capacity, the ability to scale, although they got better over time, right? It's fair to say that. It's been a while since you've seen any military like Russia's and Ukraine's being able to hold a front of 1,000 kilometers, several 100,000 troops for 2 years straight, right? And I don't see any other European military achieving this if you look at what they have available and what they have done. So here, Ukraine deserves a lot of credit. Scaling force employment is difficult. But if you look at the challenges of militaries, for example, Ukraine's biggest challenges in the offensive, as shown in 2023, scaling the employment of forces on the offense. Ukrainian brigades typically coordinate or sustain action at the level of maybe 2 reinforced companies at a time, maybe 3. It's very difficult for them to coordinate much beyond that. And this is one of the biggest problems that they had during offensive operations last year. And that's something that needs to be addressed through training and rebuilding the force quality this year. So the reason I'm telling the story is, to me, and just to be clear, I'm more of a traditionalist. I'm not a big technology fetishist. I don't believe that there are silver bullets or game changers in warfare. And I think that a lot of technology is additive and it changes how you fight over time. But to see real changes in the character of war, modern war, you need to see a lot more than technology. You need to see changes in tactics, operational concepts for how forces are employed, and they need to see 2 big other pieces. You need to see organizational capacity evolve around it. For example, the use of drones or electronic warfare, which we are seeing in Ukraine, both on the Ukrainian and the Russian side. And you need to see changes in force structure, right? The military itself change. Like you see the proliferation of drone units in Ukraine or in the Russian military. So the structure changes, the organizational capacity changes, and it starts to be integral to how a military fights. It's very different from where the war began, right? Which is some units using some drones in some places, to it now being a key aspect, what that makes that military what it is, right? And this takes time to see. Lastly, there's still a lot we don't know about this war. I spent a lot of my time trying to do field work, gathering data, because from the outside, it's very hard to be an expert on the war if you don't go to it and you don't see it. And all you have is anecdotal evidence, and people are terrible at assessing what percentage of whatever it is they're seeing is representative of the whole. Like 100% of drone videos you see are successful missions, but you don't know what percentage of actual drone missions that is,
Yeah.
What's the effectiveness of FPV drones? Is it 10%, 50%, 30%? Depends on the unit, right? So this is very important to gather to answer your question on what should we invest in? How do we understand the implications of this war for the character of war? And to what extent are things we're seeing observations in this war or lessons that we need to learn and generalize about modern warfare? These are 2 different things, because the second one requires understanding the context and being fairly confident in the data of what you observe and saying that's applicable to other wars and other types of wars.
I have a lot of questions, but we have time limit. And at the end, I would like to...
I'm happy to come back. This doesn't have to be our only conversation. We can do this in Kiev next time.
Yeah, with great pleasure. So the most banal question maybe at the end. So what do you expect from Congress voting? when and how it will continue?
I honestly don't know. I think this hangs on a wire and it's very close. I give it my own view right now is 50-50, and I'm not sufficiently expert on what's happening in Congress. I think I've been too optimistic about this in the fall, and I thought that by now it would be clear that a deal would be made and Congress would vote for it. If it doesn't happen, I think that the administration will move into like an emergency mode and try to reprogram funds and find funds elsewhere, but it's going to be very challenging. And I don't know what that'll mean for this year. I just want to be clear about that. I think Europeans will have to step in to the extent that they can in supporting Ukraine. But a lot, like I said, a lot that I think will set the course of this war is going to be decided this year. That's why I think people are overly fixated on the US presidential election. I'm not saying that by next January it won't matter. I'm just saying it doesn't matter nearly as much as people think it is. A lot of the big decisions have to be made now in the United States, in Europe, and also in Ukraine. Some of the big debates Ukraine is having are very important. If you want to be in the right place by 2025, the right decisions have to be made now.
Very good statement for the end of our conversation. Thank you very much. And I caught you. So next time when you're in Kyiv, we'll continue this. Thanks a lot.
Sure.
Just to remind you that it was a Safe and Safe Country podcast, and it was today me, Alina Frolova, and my guest, Michael Kofman. The podcast is a joint project of the Center for Defense Strategies, Ukrainskaya Pravda, and Media Center Ukraine, and you can find us on all the resources of Ukrainskaya Pravda, as well as on largest podcast platforms, Apple, Google, Spotify, and others. Safe and Safe Country podcast. Everyone can influence on how soon the prefix "on" will disappear. Thank you so much.